It was meant to be just a quiet walk between father and daughter, through the city streets. Everything changes when the child stops in front of a dog that is tied up, injured, and almost unrecognizable. The animal's gaze awakens deep memories and a recognition that cannot be ignored. From that moment on, secrets begin to emerge, revealing a truth that many tried to bury forever. It was supposed to be just a quiet, late afternoon walk, like so many others that father and daughter used to take through the tree-lined streets of Aspen Creek. Edward Nolan, a police officer with over 10 years of service, had promised his daughter Claire that he would take her for ice cream after a particularly difficult week at the precinct. He couldn't have imagined that this walk would change everything. The March sun was beginning to set gently over the mountains that surrounded the town, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink that blended with the thin afternoon clouds. Claire, only 7 years old, walked happily beside her father, softly singing a song she had learned at school and waving her hands in the air as if conducting an invisible orchestra. Her school uniform was a bit wrinkled after a full day of playing at recess, and the ribbon holding her brown hair was starting to come loose, but none of that mattered at that moment. It was Friday. The weekend was approaching, and she was going to have her favorite chocolate and strawberry ice cream. Edward watched his daughter with a discreet smile, feeling a mixture of relief and gratitude for this simple moment. The last few weeks at the precinct had been especially tense, with endless meetings, changes in command, and a growing pressure that he couldn't quite explain, not even to himself. There was something in the air at the department that bothered him, a feeling that not everything was being said, that there were whispered conversations that stopped whenever he approached. But here, walking through the familiar streets of Aspen Creek with Claire by his side, Edward could forget that uneasiness for a few moments. The town had that effect on him. After years of serving in larger, more chaotic cities, Edward had accepted the transfer to Aspen Creek as a blessing. It was a peaceful town, known for its mineral springs and mild climate, where everyone seemed to know each other, and where urban violence had not yet taken hold with the same force that dominated other regions. For Claire, who had grown up there since she was 3, this was the only reality she knew, a reality of safe parks, friendly neighbors, and quiet afternoons having ice cream with her father. They turned the corner of the town square, passing the old bandstand where musical performances were held on Sundays. It was then that Claire stopped suddenly. Edward, lost in his thoughts, took a few seconds to realize that his daughter was no longer by his side. When he turned, he found the little girl standing in the middle of the sidewalk, her eyes fixed on a point across the street. Her light and cheerful expression had been replaced by something different, something Edward couldn't immediately identify. There was sadness in that look, but also a determination he rarely saw in someone so young. Claire pointed discreetly, with a small, hesitant finger, and in a choked voice she whispered the words that would change everything. "Daddy, I want that dog." Edward followed his daughter's gaze, expecting to see a playful puppy in a shop window, or perhaps a pet dog being walked by a neighbor. What he found, however, made his body freeze from the inside. On the other side of the street, in the shadow of a lamppost that was already beginning to light up with the arrival of dusk, was a German shepherd of imposing stature, though visibly debilitated. The animal was tied with a short, thick chain that kept it very close to the post, drastically limiting its movements. Its coat, which should have been shiny and well cared for, was dirty and patchy in several areas, revealing dry and scarred skin. Its ribs were visible under the stretched skin, betraying weeks or perhaps months of malnutrition. The dog shivered slightly, despite the lingering warmth of the afternoon, and its deep, tired eyes seemed to carry the weight of experiences that no one had ever wanted to hear. In front of the animal, leaning precariously against the post, was a piece of cardboard with a message written in black marker in shaky, irregular letters. $1 for a wounded dog. Edward read those words 3 times, trying to process the absurdity of the situation. That image didn't fit with the cheerful and familiar scenery of the town. It didn't make sense. In Aspen Creek, where everyone knew and helped each other, how could someone leave an animal in that state, exposed and for sale, as if it were a disposable object? Edward felt Claire's small hand grip his tightly. When he looked down, he saw tears beginning to form in his daughter's eyes. She said nothing more, just continued to look. at the dog with an expression that mixed compassion and urgency. There was something in the way Claire looked at that animal that Edward couldn't ignore. It wasn't just pity. It was as if the girl recognized something greater in that suffering being, something that needed to be saved. Edward took a few hesitant steps toward the animal, crossing the street carefully and keeping Claire by his side. As he got closer, a strange feeling began to grow in his chest. There was something familiar about that dog, the way it kept its head down but was still alert to its surroundings. The old scar on its left shoulder, partially covered by the dirty fur. The slight imbalance when it put weight on its right hind leg, as if an old injury still bothered it. Edward felt his heart race. Those characteristics, those specific details, they weren't common. They were unique, and he knew them very well. For the last 8 months, Edward had worked directly with the precinct's K9 units. It was part of his duties to coordinate operations involving the police dogs, and during that time, he had developed a special partnership with a German shepherd named Shadow. The animal was exceptional at his job, with a keen sense of smell and unwavering loyalty. Together, Edward and Shadow had participated in several successful operations, from searches in rural areas to tracking illegal materials in urban operations. But then, 6 months ago, Shadow had disappeared. The official explanation had been vague and unsatisfactory. Lost during transport, the report said. The dog was being taken for a routine veterinary evaluation when the transport vehicle had a mechanical problem. According to the official version, Shadow had run away during the stop for repairs, and despite the searches conducted in the following days, he was never found. Edward had never fully believed that story. There were details that didn't make sense, questions that went unanswered, a suspicious haste to end the search and close the case. But he was just a sergeant, with no authority to question superior decisions. Eventually, pressured by routine and the lack of concrete evidence, Edward was forced to accept the loss and move on. The pain of not having answers, however, had never completely left him. And now, there he was, standing before a German shepherd that could very well be Shadow. Or was it just his imagination, fueled by guilt and the desire for answers? Edward knelt slowly, getting down to the animal's level. The dog didn't growl, didn't back away, didn't show aggression or extreme fear. On the contrary, it just watched him with those silent, deep eyes, as if assessing whether it could trust this man. Claire, without any hesitation, also knelt beside her father. Edward instinctively reached out to protect her, but the girl had already approached the animal, gently stroking the dog's muzzle with her small hands. The German shepherd responded with an almost imperceptible wag of its tail, a minimal gesture. That in other circumstances would be insignificant, but in that context was profoundly revealing. Edward felt his stomach churn. The chain was fastened tightly around the animal's neck, causing visible red marks on the fur. He examined it more closely, and his heart leaped. There, partially hidden by the dirt and matted fur, was the characteristic scar on the left shoulder, a mark from an old wound, the result of an accident during a training exercise years ago. Edward knew that scar. He had seen it hundreds of times during the months he worked with Shadow. It was him. There was no longer any doubt. This abandoned, mistreated dog, displayed like merchandise in the central square of Aspen Creek, was Shadow, his partner, his work companion, the animal that had saved lives and had mysteriously disappeared. Edward felt a wave of conflicting emotions, relief at having found Shadow alive, anger at the deplorable condition the animal was in, confusion about how he had ended up here, and a growing suspicion that there was much more to this story than he had ever imagined. "Daddy, he's hungry," Claire's voice broke through his thoughts. The girl had found a piece of bread in her school backpack and was offering it to the dog, who ate with a desperate voracity that broke Edward's heart. "Can we take him home, Daddy? Please." The plea in Claire's eyes was impossible to ignore. Edward looked around, searching for who might be responsible for leaving the animal in such a condition. There was no one nearby, no nearby house with its lights on, no suspicious car, no one watching. Whoever had left Shadow there was not interested in monitoring him or ensuring he was sold. The dog had simply been abandoned with a ridiculous price in the hope that someone would take him. Edward made a quick decision. He took his wallet out of his pocket, placed a $5 bill under the rock holding down the cardboard, and began to work on the chain that held Shadow. The lock was simple, but rusted. It took a few minutes of effort before Edward managed to force it open. When he finally freed the animal, Shadow remained motionless for a few seconds, as if he couldn't believe he was free. Then, suddenly and unexpectedly, the dog tried to stand up, but its legs trembled and it collapsed heavily on the ground. A faint whimper escaped its throat, a sound that echoed in Edward's soul like a silent cry for help. Claire let out a small cry of concern and knelt beside the animal, stroking its head tenderly. "We need to get him to a vet now," Edward said urgently, already mentally calculating the nearest clinic that would be open at that hour. Carefully but with determination, Edward lifted Shadow into his arms. The dog, which should have weighed around 80 pounds in healthy condition, felt much lighter, an evident result of severe malnutrition. Shadow didn't resist, just rested his head against Edward's chest, closing his eyes as if he could finally relax after months of tension and suffering. Claire followed beside her father as they walked quickly to where the car was parked, a few blocks away. The ice cream was completely forgotten. Now there was something much more important at stake. The entire way the girl kept one hand on Shadow, whispering words of comfort that the dog seemed to somehow understand. Edward drove quickly but carefully to the St. Francis Veterinary Clinic, a trusted establishment that operated with a 24-hour emergency service. Dr. Marion Foster, an experienced veterinarian whom Edward knew from other visits, was on duty that night. When she saw the state of the animal, her face took on a grave expression. "He needs immediate care," she said, as she quickly organized a gurney and called her assistant. Edward, following the veterinarian's instructions, carefully placed Shadow on the padded surface. The dog opened its eyes briefly, located Edward with its gaze, and then closed them again, too exhausted to remain conscious. Claire was instructed to stay in the waiting room while Dr. Foster took Shadow into the examination room. The girl reluctantly obeyed, pressing her face against the glass that separated the reception area from the treatment area, watching with wide, worried eyes as the veterinary team worked on the animal. Edward also remained outside, pacing back and forth in the small waiting room, his hands in his pockets and his mind racing. He took out his phone and on impulse began to scroll through his old messages, looking for communications from the time Shadow had disappeared. There was something wrong with that whole story. Shadow hadn't just run away, and now finding him in this condition, abandoned and mistreated in the town square, that was no coincidence. The door to the examination room opened, and Dr. Foster came out, pulling off her surgical gloves with a serious expression. Edward approached immediately, with Claire right behind him. "How is he, Doctor?" Marion sighed before answering. "Stable for now. We've managed to hydrate him and administer the first medications. But Edward, I have to be honest with you. This animal has been through something terrible. We're not just talking about abandonment or neglect. The marks I've found indicate he was kept in extremely poor conditions for a prolonged period." "What kind of marks?" Edward asked, though part of him already knew the answer. The veterinarian chose her words carefully, aware of Claire's presence. "Old wounds that healed poorly, signs of severe malnutrition that don't happen overnight, and the marks on his neck and paws suggest he was confined to very small spaces for long periods. Edward, whoever had this animal did not treat him as they should have. He has suffered a great deal." "Daddy, is Shadow going to be okay?" Claire tugged on Edward's shirt, her eyes welling with tears. Edward knelt down, getting to his daughter's level. "Yes, he will, sweetheart. Dr. Foster is going to take very good care of him, but he's going to need to stay here for a few days to recover completely. Do you agree?" Claire nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "Can I see him before we go?" Marion smiled gently. "Of course you can. Come on, I'll take you to him." While Claire followed the veterinarian, Edward remained in the reception area, his phone still in his hand. He opened his messaging app and found the name of Lieutenant Robert Martin, his direct superior at the time of Shadow's disappearance. He started to type a message, then stopped, deleted it all, and put the phone away. It wasn't time to ask questions yet. First, he needed answers on his own. In the examination room, Claire was sitting beside the gurney where Shadow rested, now connected to an IV drip and covered with a thermal blanket. The girl gently held the dog's paw, softly humming the same song she had been singing on the way to get ice cream. Shadow, even sedated, moved his ears slightly at the sound of the girl's voice, as if that melody somehow reached him even through the fog of the medication. When Edward entered the room, he found a scene that moved him deeply. His daughter, so small and fragile, caring with all her love and tenderness for an animal that had suffered so much. There was something profoundly significant in that moment, something that went beyond the obvious. It was as if fate had orchestrated that meeting in the square, uniting three lives that needed each other. Dr. Foster approached Edward and spoke in a low voice. "He has a microchip. I was able to read the data. He's registered as Shadow, a police dog from the Aspen Creek PD, reported as lost 6 months ago." Edward nodded slowly. "I know, I used to work with him." The veterinarian's expression became even more grave. "Then you know this doesn't make sense. A police dog doesn't just disappear like that, and he certainly doesn't reappear in this condition without something very wrong having happened." "I know," Edward replied, his jaw tight, "and I'm going to find out what happened." "Be careful, Edward. If someone did this to a police dog, they are dangerous people. And if you start asking questions—" "I know the risks," Edward interrupted, but his voice was firm and determined. "But I can't just let this go. Shadow was my partner, and now—" He looked at Claire, who was still singing softly to the dog. "Now he's part of our family." Marion placed a hand on Edward's shoulder. "I'll do everything in my power to help him recover, but the physical recovery is only part of the process. The psychological trauma he's suffered will take time to heal. He'll need patience, love, and a safe environment." "He'll have all of that," Edward promised. That night, after leaving Shadow in the care of the veterinary clinic, Edward took Claire home. The girl was exhausted but talked the whole way about how she would take care of Shadow, about the space they would prepare for him in the yard, about the toys they would buy. Edward listened in silence, his heart aching at his daughter's pure and innocent excitement, while his mind was filled with dark questions and disturbing suspicions. At home, after putting Claire to bed, Edward sat at the kitchen table with his laptop. He knew he was about to cross a line, but there was no turning back. He accessed the police department's internal system with his credentials and began to search for Shadow's file. The dog's record should have been relatively easy to access, a standard document with information about his training, service history, and the circumstances of his disappearance. But when Edward finally located the file, he found something completely unexpected. The file was sealed with the highest level of confidentiality. No other animal in the canine unit had received this type of documentary restriction. It was a protocol normally reserved for special operations or ongoing investigations involving sensitive information. Edward felt a chill run down his spine. Why would the file of a supposedly lost police dog be sealed with the highest level of confidentiality? He tried to access the document with his credentials but was denied. The message on the screen was clear and direct. Access restricted, high-level authorization required. He then looked for the reports of the last operations Shadow had participated in before disappearing. He found vague references to an operation conducted in an abandoned warehouse in the rural part of Aspen Creek about a week before the disappearance. The official report described the operation as routine, with no major incidents. But there was a note at the bottom, almost imperceptible, written in a smaller font. Internal transfer pending. Access restricted. There was no signature, no official protocol number, just an authorization code that Edward recognized as belonging to a rank much higher than his. Someone with considerable power had ordered Shadow's file to be sealed, and that same person had authorized an internal transfer that was never officially documented. Edward closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair, running his hands over his face. He was beginning to understand that he had stumbled upon something much bigger than he had imagined. Shadow hadn't just gotten lost. He had been deliberately removed, and someone had gone to great lengths to erase his tracks, or at least make them extremely difficult to follow. But why? What could a police dog have discovered or witnessed to justify such an effort to make him disappear? Edward knew that Shadow was exceptional at his job, especially at sniffing out things that were well hidden. If the dog had found something during that operation at the abandoned warehouse, something that shouldn't have been found, it would explain a lot. Edward thought of his superior, Lieutenant Robert Martin. The man had been strangely evasive when Edward pressed for more information about Shadow's disappearance. At the time, Edward had attributed it to incompetence or lack of interest. But now, reviewing those conversations with a new perspective, he began to see a pattern. Martin wasn't just being evasive. He was actively trying to discourage any deeper investigation. Edward's phone vibrated, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from Marcus Oliver, a colleague from the precinct whom Edward trusted. Marcus worked in the administrative sector and had access to documents and information that weren't always easily accessible to other officers. The message was short and direct. "Heard you found Shadow. We need to talk. Tomorrow, breakfast at Joe's Diner. Come alone." Edward stared at the message for a long moment before replying, "Deal." He knew Marcus wouldn't contact him like that, with that tone of urgency and secrecy, if he didn't have important information, and the fact that Marcus had found out so quickly that Edward had found Shadow suggested that there were people watching, people who were paying attention to any movement related to the dog. Edward turned off the kitchen lights and went upstairs toward Claire's room. The door was ajar and he peeked inside. The girl was sleeping soundly, hugging her favorite teddy bear, a soft smile on her face, probably dreaming of Shadow, of the care they would give the dog, of the happy days to come. Edward felt a renewed wave of determination. He didn't know exactly what he was getting into, but he knew he couldn't back down now, not only because Shadow deserved justice, but because Claire deserved to grow up in a world where the truth mattered, where doing the right thing was worth it, even when it was hard. His daughter's innocent request in the square had turned into something much bigger. It was about courage, about integrity, about not accepting that wrong could become the norm. Edward gently closed the bedroom door and went to his own room, but he knew he wouldn't sleep easily that night. His mind was filled with questions, possibilities, and worries. He had worked for over 10 years in the police force and had always believed he was on the right side of the law, on the side of justice. But now, for the first time, he was beginning to question if there were things happening within the department itself. That contradicted everything he believed in. At the St. Francis Veterinary Clinic, Shadow was also awake despite the sedatives. His eyes were open in the dimness of the recovery room, fixed on the door through which Edward and Claire had left. For the first time in months, the dog felt something he had forgotten: hope. The hope that maybe, just maybe, his days of suffering were coming to an end, and that those two people, the man he recognized as his former partner and the girl with the sweet voice and gentle hands, were the keys to his salvation. Morning arrived with the characteristic sound of birds inhabiting the trees around Edward's house. It was Saturday, and normally he would take the opportunity to sleep in. But that morning, his eyes opened even before the alarm went off. The few hours of sleep he managed were populated by restless dreams, fragments of memories mixed with suspicions and unanswered questions. He got up, took a quick shower, and checked on Claire's room. The girl was still sleeping soundly, which was good, because Edward needed to leave early for his meeting with Marcus. He left a note in the kitchen for his sister, Lucy, who lived nearby and often came over on Saturdays for coffee with them. In the note, Edward briefly explained that he had gone out to deal with work matters and would be back soon. He didn't mention anything about Shadow or the secret meeting. The fewer people who knew at that moment, the better. Joe's Diner was on a quiet street in downtown Aspen Creek, a traditional establishment that had been around for decades and was known for serving the best coffee cake in town. It was early, just after 7 in the morning, and the place was still quiet. Just a few regulars, workers stopping for a quick coffee before starting their day. Edward went in and found Marcus sitting at a table in the back, away from the windows and the door. His colleague gestured discreetly for him to approach. Marcus Oliver was 43, with almost 15 years on the force, and worked in the precinct's administrative sector. He was a man of medium height, with discreetly framed glasses and hair starting to go grey at the temples. He had a reputation for being meticulous, reliable, and above all discreet. If Marcus had requested this secret meeting, it was because he had something important to reveal. Edward sat down across from his colleague, who immediately pushed a cup of steaming coffee toward him. They were silent for a few seconds, just observing their surroundings to make sure no one was paying attention to them. It was Marcus who finally broke the silence, speaking in a low but clear voice. "Did you really find Shadow?" Edward nodded. "Yesterday, in the town square. He was tied to a post, malnourished, injured. Someone was trying to get rid of him for $1. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, as if that confirmation brought a pain he had been trying to avoid. "I was afraid of that." "Afraid of what?" Edward leaned forward, lowering his voice even more. "Marcus, what do you know? Why is Shadow's file sealed? What happened in that warehouse operation?" Marcus looked around once more before answering. "Edward, what I'm about to tell you could put you in danger. It could put your family in danger. Are you sure you want to know?" "I need to know," Edward replied without hesitation. "Shadow was my partner. He deserves for the truth to come out, and if there's something wrong happening in the department, I can't just pretend I didn't see it." Marcus sighed deeply, taking off his glasses and cleaning the lenses with a paper napkin, a nervous gesture Edward recognized. "All right. But you didn't hear any of this from me, understood? If anyone asks, you figured it all out on your own." "Understood." Marcus put his glasses back on and began to speak, choosing each word carefully. "About 6 months ago, there was an operation at an abandoned warehouse in the rural area. Officially, it was to execute a search and seizure warrant related to suspicious activities. Nothing major, a routine job. You were scheduled for that operation along with Shadow, but it was cancelled at the last minute. Remember?" Edward frowned, searching his memory. "Yes, I remember. They said there was a problem with the paperwork and that another team would take over." "Exactly, another team took over. A team led by Lieutenant Robert Martin, and Shadow went with them, because Martin insisted he needed a sniffer dog for the operation. The problem is, that wasn't a routine operation, Edward. There was something else happening in that warehouse." "Like what?" Marcus took out his phone, unlocked it, and showed Edward a series of photos that looked like screenshots of official documents. The warehouse was registered in the name of a shell company, one of those that only exists on paper. But through some deeper research, I found that this company has connections to influential people in the region. Politicians, businessmen, people with a lot of power and a lot of money. And what were they doing in that warehouse? "I'm not sure," Marcus admitted. "The official reports say they found nothing. But there are rumors, Edward. Rumors that the place was used as a storage and distribution point, not just for ordinary goods, but for things that shouldn't be in circulation." Edward felt a tightness in his chest. "And Shadow?" Shadow sniffed something out. "I spoke with Corporal Silver, one of the men who participated in the operation. He told me in confidence that Shadow became extremely agitated in a specific area of the warehouse. He started digging and barking, indicating he had found something, but Martin ordered them to pull the dog away immediately, said Shadow was behaving erratically, and needed to be removed from the operation." "That doesn't make sense," Edward interrupted. "Shadow was one of the best-trained dogs in the unit. He didn't have erratic behaviors. If he was indicating something, it's because there was something to be found." "Exactly. But the order was clear. Shadow was removed from the warehouse and put in a transport vehicle. And here comes the part no one wants to talk about openly. According to Corporal Silva, Martin stayed in the warehouse for over 2 hours after the operation officially ended. He was alone, or with only 1 or 2 men he trusted. When they finally left, Corporal Silva noticed that the area where Shadow had signaled was different. The ground had been disturbed, as if something had been removed from there. And Shadow was supposedly taken for a routine veterinary evaluation. But he never got there. The transport vehicle had a mechanical problem, or so they say. The dog ran away, or so they say, and then the record started to be modified. Shadow's file was sealed, reports were altered, and anyone who asked too many questions was quickly discouraged. Edward felt anger rising inside him. They tried to get rid of Shadow because he found something compromising, something that Martin or other people wanted to keep hidden. Marcus nodded gravely. That's my conclusion too. And the fact that Shadow has reappeared now, after months in such a deplorable condition, suggests that someone kept him locked up somewhere, probably hoping he would die or be forgotten. But Shadow is strong, he survived, and now he's living proof that something very wrong happened. Edward took a sip of his now lukewarm coffee, trying to process all this information. I need concrete proof, Marcus. I need something I can use to take this forward officially. Marcus shook his head. That's the problem, Edward. The proof has been destroyed or hidden. The documents have been modified. The people who know something are afraid to talk. You're dealing with people who have power and connections. If you try to push this without solid proof, you'll just get burned, and you could end up like Shadow, discarded and silenced. So what do you suggest I do? Just accept this? Pretend I don't know anything? No, Marcus replied, but his voice had a tone of urgency. I suggest you be extremely careful. Gather information discreetly. Look for allies you can trust and keep Shadow safe, because if the right people find out he's alive and in your care, they might try to finish the job they started. Edward felt a chill. You think they would try to do something to Shadow? To me? To my family? I think you're dealing with people who have already shown they're willing to do terrible things to protect their secrets. So yes, Edward, I think you need to be very careful. They were silent for a moment, the weight of their conversation hanging over them. Finally, Edward spoke. Why are you telling me all this, Marcus? You said yourself it's dangerous. Why risk it? Marcus smiled sadly. Because I also had a canine partner once, many years ago, a dog named Thor. He died in the line of duty, but he died doing his job, protecting people. He had a dignified death. Shadow doesn't deserve to end his days suffering and abandoned because of the greed and corruption of a few. He deserves justice. And if I can help with that, even if it's just by sharing information, then it's the least I can do. Edward extended his hand and shook Marcus's firmly. Thank you, truly. I'll be careful, I promise, but I'm not careful. I'm going to let this go either. I know you won't. That's why I'm telling you. But Edward, remember one thing. Sometimes the best way to fight powerful people isn't direct confrontation. It's strategy. It's gathering allies, building a solid case, and waiting for the right moment. Haste can be your enemy. Edward nodded, absorbing the advice. They talked for a few more minutes about specific details, names of people who might be involved, locations and dates that Marcus had noted in his discreet investigations. When they finally said goodbye, Edward left the diner with his mind buzzing with information and plans. The drive home was on autopilot, as Edward processed everything he had just discovered. The situation was worse and more complex than he had imagined. It wasn't just about neglect or incompetence. There was a deliberate conspiracy involving people in positions of power to cover up something Shadow had discovered in that warehouse. And now, by rescuing him, Edward had inadvertently placed himself in the middle of this web of secrets and dangers. When he got home, he found Claire and his sister Lucy having breakfast in the kitchen. The girl was excited, telling her aunt about meeting Shadow and how they were going to take care of him. Lucy listened attentively, asking questions and showing genuine interest in the story. She was 5 years younger than Edward, an elementary school teacher, and had a special connection with Claire. Edward, are you really going to keep this dog? Lucy asked as soon as he entered the kitchen. Isn't it better to return him to the police? After all, he's an official dog, isn't he? Edward poured himself some coffee and sat at the table, choosing his words carefully. Shadow isn't in any condition to work anymore, Lou. He's been through terrible things and needs a safe home to recover. Claire and I are going to take care of him. Claire beamed. Are we going to visit him today, Daddy? Dr. Foster said we could go in the morning. Of course we are, Edward replied, trying to maintain a light tone despite the tension he felt. How about after you finish your breakfast? The visit to the St. Francis Veterinary Clinic revealed a small but significant improvement in Shadow's condition. The dog was more alert, though still very weak. When Claire entered the recovery room, Shadow lifted his head and wagged his tail slightly, a sign of recognition that deeply touched everyone present. Dr. Foster explained that Shadow would need at least another week at the clinic for intensive treatments, but after that, he could continue his recovery at home as long as they strictly followed the medical instructions. Claire spent almost 2 hours with the dog, talking to him, stroking his fur, and even reading aloud from a storybook she had brought from home. Edward watched the scene with a mixture of tenderness and concern. Seeing the connection between his daughter and Shadow was beautiful, but it also increased his responsibility. He wasn't just protecting an animal now, he was protecting someone his daughter loved deeply. The weight of that responsibility was immense. Over the next few days, Edward maintained a careful routine. He went to work as usual, fulfilling his duties without drawing attention to himself. But in his spare time, discreetly, he began his own investigation. He reviewed old files, talked to trusted colleagues, and looked for inconsistencies in official reports. Every small discovery was noted in a notebook he kept hidden at home, never on a computer or phone where it could be tracked. Claire visited Shadow every day after school. The routine had become sacred to her. Edward would take her to the clinic, and while the girl spent time with the dog, he would take the opportunity to talk with Dr. Foster about the recovery progress. The animal was responding well to the treatments. The wounds were healing, he had gained weight and was starting to show more energy. One afternoon, while Edward was waiting for Claire to finish her visit, Dr. Foster pulled him aside for a private conversation in her office. "Edward, I need to tell you something. Last night, a man came here asking about Shadow." Edward felt his body tense. "What kind of man?" He identified himself as a member of the police department, but didn't show official identification. He said he had heard that a department dog had been found and was being treated here. He wanted details about Shadow's condition, about who had brought him in, and when he would be discharged. "And you told him?" Edward asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "No. I said I could only discuss patient information with the legal guardians and that, as far as I knew, Shadow had been officially listed as lost, which technically made him an animal without a defined legal owner at the moment." The man didn't like the answer, but he didn't insist much. He just said he would be back with the proper documentation. Edward felt adrenaline start to course through his veins. "What did he look like? Do you remember any features?" "Tall, around 40, dark hair cut short, a gold ring on his right hand with some kind of symbol I couldn't identify. He had a military posture, you know, that way of carrying himself that makes the training clear. But there was something in his eyes, Edward, something that made me uncomfortable. If he comes back, call me immediately, and don't give any information about Shadow to anyone, no matter what credentials they present. Promise?" "I promise," Marion replied. "Edward, you're in some serious trouble, aren't you? Because if you are, you need to be very careful." "I know, and I am. But thank you for warning me. You may have saved Shadow's life by not giving that man information." After that conversation, Edward took additional security measures. He talked to Lucy and, without going into too much detail, asked her to be extra vigilant when Claire was in her care. He also installed security cameras around his house, something he had been putting off for a while, but which had now become urgent. A week and a half after the rescue, Shadow was finally discharged from the veterinary clinic. Dr. Foster provided detailed instructions on medications, a special diet, and gradual exercise. Claire was overjoyed. Edward had prepared a comfortable space in the yard, with a proper doghouse, fresh water always available, and a shaded area where Shadow could rest. Shadow's arrival home was an emotional moment. The dog explored the yard slowly, still cautious but visibly more relaxed than when he was found in the square. Claire never left his side, introducing him to every corner of the space, showing him the toys she had bought with her allowance, and explaining where he would sleep. Edward watched the scene from the porch, a glass of juice in his hand and a tightness in his heart. There was something deeply comforting in seeing Shadow in a safe environment, surrounded by affection, but there was also a constant sense of alert that at any moment something could go wrong. That night, after Claire had gone to sleep, Edward sat in the yard beside Shadow. The dog was lying in his new house, his eyes open and alert to his surroundings. Edward began to speak in a low voice, as if Shadow could understand every word. I know you've been through terrible things, buddy. I know that people who should have protected you hurt you. But that's over now. You're safe here. Claire loves you, and I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure no one ever hurts you again." Shadow turned his head toward Edward, and for a moment, their eyes met. There was an understanding there, a silent connection between two beings who had shared experiences of loyalty and betrayal. Edward reached out his hand, and Shadow, after a brief hesitation, came closer and allowed the man to stroke his head. In the days that followed, life took on a new routine. Claire went to school, Edward went to work, but both counted the hours until they could come home and spend time with Shadow. The dog was recovering well, gaining weight and strength. The transformation was remarkable. The animal that had been found trembling and desperate in the square was gradually giving way to a more confident and alert German shepherd. But not everything was peaceful. Edward noticed strange things at work. Lingering glances from colleagues, conversations that stopped abruptly when he approached, a general feeling that he was being watched. Lieutenant Robert Martin had tried to strike up a conversation a few times, asking seemingly casual questions about how Edward was spending his free time, if he had done anything interesting recently. Edward responded vaguely, keeping the conversation superficial, but each interaction with Martin reinforced his conviction that the man was involved in what had happened to Shadow. There was an underlying tension in those conversations, a kind of cat-and-mouse game where both knew there was something unsaid, something dangerous hanging in the air. One evening, Edward was reviewing his personal files at home when his phone rang. It was an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello?" "Sergeant Nolan," a male voice said on the other end of the line, a voice he didn't recognize. "We need to talk about a delicate matter." "Who is this?" "That's not important right now. What's important is that you understand you're meddling in things. You shouldn't be. The dog you rescued, he would have been better off left where he was." Edward felt anger burn in his chest. "Shadow is not a thing to be discarded, and if you or anyone else tries to do anything to him or my family, you will regret it." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'm not threatening your family, Sergeant. I'm trying to protect it. There are forces at play here that you don't fully comprehend, people who do not tolerate interference. My advice is that you return the animal to the proper authorities, declare that he was found, and let the matter die, for everyone's sake. And if I refuse, then you'll be making a choice, and choices have consequences. Think carefully, Sergeant. Think about your daughter. She's so young, with her whole life ahead of her. It would be a tragedy if something happened because of a dog." The call ended before Edward could respond. He stood there, the phone still in his hand, trembling with anger and fear. That had been a veiled threat against Claire, there was no doubt. Whoever was behind this was willing to use his daughter as a pressure tool. Edward went upstairs and into Claire's room. The girl was sleeping peacefully, completely oblivious to the dangers surrounding her. He kissed her forehead gently and made a silent promise. No matter what it cost, he would protect his daughter. And he would protect Shadow too. Because giving up now would be teaching Claire that doing the right thing is only worth it when it's easy and safe. It would be teaching her to bow to threats and injustice. The next morning, Edward made a decision. He needed help from someone outside the police department, someone who could look at this situation with objective eyes and had the authority to act. After much consideration, he decided to contact the Internal Affairs Division, the body responsible for investigating irregularities within the department. It was a delicate process. Edward knew that a formal complaint could trigger a series of unpredictable events, but he also knew he couldn't remain passive any longer. He prepared a document detailing everything he had discovered, without mentioning his sources to protect people like Marcus. He included photographs of Shadow in the condition he was found, medical reports from Dr. Foster, and pointed out the inconsistencies in the official reports about the dog's disappearance. Before sending the document, Edward made copies and left them in safe places, including one with Lucy, with clear instructions on what to do if something happened to him. It was a grim but necessary precaution. When he finally submitted the complaint, Edward felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The gears had been set in motion. There was no going back. Now it was a matter of waiting and seeing how things would unfold. That afternoon, when Edward arrived home, he found Claire in the yard with Shadow. The girl had taken out her watercolor paints and was painting a portrait of the dog. Shadow was lying patiently, posing as if he understood he was the model. It was such a pure scene, so full of innocence and love, that Edward felt his eyes well up. "How's it coming along?" Edward asked, approaching. Claire proudly showed him her painting. "It's not perfect yet, but I'm trying to capture how beautiful his eyes are. Do you see, Daddy? They're like they have stories to tell." Edward knelt beside his daughter, looking at the painting. "It's beautiful, Claire. You're very talented. And yes, I see it. Shadow has stories to tell. Sad stories, but also stories of courage and survival. He's going to stay with us forever, right, Daddy?" Claire asked, her voice filled with a vulnerable hope. "No one is going to take him away?" Edward hugged his daughter. "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure Shadow stays with us. He's part of our family now." That night, Edward had trouble sleeping. His mind was filled with worries and possible scenarios. The complaint had been filed. He was now officially a whistleblower, someone who had broken the silence and pointed out irregularities within the department. There was a fine line between being seen as a hero of integrity and being labeled as a problem, someone who didn't know when to let things be. But when Edward finally managed to fall asleep, it was with a clear conscience. He had done the right thing. He had chosen truth and justice over convenience and silence, and no matter what the consequences were, that was a choice he could stand by in front of his daughter, in front of Shadow, and in front of himself. The days following Edward's complaint were marked by a growing tension that permeated every aspect of his life. At the precinct, things began to change in subtle but undeniable ways. Colleagues who once greeted Edward warmly now just gave a brief nod. Conversations ceased when he entered the room. There was a climate of distrust in the air, as if everyone knew something was happening, but no one wanted to talk about it openly. Edward kept his head down, carrying out his duties with the same dedication as always, but his senses were on high alert. Every prolonged glance, every whispered conversation, every change in the behavior of those around him was mentally registered. He knew internal affairs would take some time to process his complaint, but he also knew that rumors spread quickly in closed environments like the precinct. It was on a Tuesday, almost 10 days after submitting the complaint, that Edward was called to the office of Captain Frank Bridges, the precinct commander. It was mid-afternoon, and Edward was finishing a report when he received the message. The tone was formal, almost cold. "Report to the commander's office immediately." Edward went up the stairs to the second floor of the administrative building, where Bridges' office was. The secretary, Mrs. Martha, a middle-aged woman who had worked there for decades, barely looked at him as she waved him in. That was unusual. Mrs. Martha always had a smile and a kind word for everyone. Inside the office, Edward found not only Captain Bridges but also Lieutenant Robert Martin, and a man he didn't immediately recognize. He was a middle-aged man with neatly trimmed grey hair, wearing a dark suit that contrasted with the military-style uniforms of the others present. There was something in his posture that suggested authority and power. "Sergeant Nolan, Captain," Bridges began, his voice laced with poorly concealed disapproval. "This is Dr. August Ferrer from the Internal Affairs Division. He's here regarding certain allegations that have been made recently." Edward felt his heart race but kept his expression neutral. "I understand, sir." Dr. Ferrer stepped forward, opening a folder he was holding. "Sergeant Nolan, you filed a formal complaint alleging irregularities in the treatment and subsequent disappearance of a police dog identified as Shadow. You also insinuated that members of this unit were involved in improper activities during a specific operation 6 months ago. These are serious accusations." "They are not just accusations," Edward replied, keeping his voice firm. "They are documented facts. Shadow was found in deplorable conditions, abandoned, and clearly mistreated. The official reports on his disappearance are inconsistent and vague, and there is evidence that documents were altered or sealed without proper justification." "Evidence," Dr. Ferrer repeated, as if savoring the word. "Sergeant, do you have any concrete evidence of misconduct, or are your allegations based primarily on speculation and personal interpretations of events?" I have Shadow, Edward answered. He is the living proof that something went very wrong. A police dog doesn't disappear for 6 months and reappear in the condition he was in without there having been criminal negligence or worse. Lieutenant Martin spoke for the first time, his voice thick with barely contained irritation. Sergeant, no one is questioning that the animal suffered, but you are making a huge logical leap by suggesting that the department is responsible for it. Shadow was reported as lost. He could have fallen into the hands of bad people. These things happen. Edward turned to Martin, making direct eye contact. With all due respect, sir, these things don't happen to trained police dogs, and they definitely don't happen when there are so many irregularities in the procedures and documentation. Captain Bridges slammed his hand on the desk, drawing everyone's attention. Enough. Sergeant Nolan, your complaint is being investigated, as is standard procedure. However, until this investigation is concluded, you are being temporarily suspended from your operational duties. You will continue to receive your salary and benefits, but you will not participate in field operations or have access to confidential files. Edward felt as if he had been punched in the gut. Suspended? Why? I haven't done anything wrong. It's a standard preventive measure, Dr. Ferrer explained, his tone professional but not necessarily hostile. When a member of the department makes serious allegations against other members, it is necessary to ensure that the investigation proceeds without interference. Your suspension is not punitive, it's procedural. And how long will this last? Until the investigation is concluded. It could be a few weeks, it could be a few months. It depends on the complexity of the facts being investigated and the cooperation of all parties involved. Edward knew that arguing further would be useless at that moment. He nodded briefly. I understand. Anything else? Not for now, Captain Bridges replied. I may leave. Mrs. Martha will provide you with the necessary paperwork regarding your temporary suspension. Edward left the office with his hands trembling slightly from anger and frustration. Temporary suspension. Standard preventive measure. He knew this game. It was a way to silence him, to isolate him, and to send a clear message to others who might think of making similar complaints. See what happens when you don't stay quiet. When he got home that afternoon, earlier than usual, Edward found Claire in the yard doing her homework while Shadow rested by her side. The scene should have been comforting, but Edward only felt a growing weight in his chest. He had risked everything with his complaint, and now he was starting to feel the consequences. Claire looked up and smiled when she saw her father. Daddy, you're home early. Want to help with my math homework? Edward forced a smile. Of course, sweetheart. I'm just going to change first, okay? Inside the house, Edward allowed himself a few moments of weakness. He sat on the bed, his head in his hands, fighting the feeling that he had made a terrible mistake. But then his phone buzzed. It was a message from Marcus. Heard about the suspension. Don't give up. You're doing the right thing. Those simple words were like a balm. Edward took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and went to change. He had chosen this path consciously. There was no going back now. All he could do was move forward and trust that the truth would eventually prevail. The following days were difficult in a different way. Edward was not used to being at home during the day. His routine had always been structured around work, responsibilities, and military discipline. Now, suddenly, he had too much free time and a restless mind that couldn't rest. He used the time to get closer to Claire and Shadow. He took his daughter to school every morning, picked her up every afternoon, and spent hours in the yard with the dog, working on his physical and emotional recovery. Shadow was responding remarkably well to the care. His coat was shinier, his gaze more lively, his movements more confident. It was as if, feeling safe and loved, the animal was finally allowing his true self to re-emerge from the depths of trauma. One afternoon, while watching Claire play with Shadow, Edward received an unexpected visitor. It was Dr. Marion, the veterinarian who had treated Shadow. She seemed tense when Edward opened the door. Doctor, what a surprise. Has something happened? Marion looked around before answering. May I come in? I need to talk to you about something important. Edward led her into the living room, offering her water, which she politely declined. Marion sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands clasped, clearly uncomfortable. Edward, Since Shadow was discharged, I've been getting visitors at the clinic. People asking questions about him, about you, about the animal's recovery status. At first I thought they were just curious people, or maybe police officers interested in the well-being of a department dog. But yesterday something happened that scared me. What? A man showed up late at night after the clinic had already closed. He banged on the door insistently until I answered. He said he needed Shadow's complete medical records, including all the photographs we took of his injuries. When I questioned his authority to request them, he became aggressive. Not physically, but verbally. He said I was interfering in matters that were none of my business, and that it would be better to cooperate. Edward felt anger rise. Did you give him the records? No, I said I would need a court order or written authorization from the animal's legal guardian, which in this case would be you. He didn't like the answer, but he eventually left. But Edward, he scared me, and I'm worried he might come back, perhaps with more persuasive methods. Edward ran a hand over his face, thinking quickly. Doctor, do something for me. Make copies of all of Shadow's records, photographs, reports, everything. Keep one copy in a safe place away from the clinic and send me another digital copy. If anyone threatens you again, don't hesitate to call the police, and call me too. Do you think they would actually do something? I think there are people who are very nervous about the fact that Shadow is alive and recovering. He's a witness, in a way, and witnesses can be inconvenient for those who have something to hide. Marion nodded slowly, processing the information. There's one more thing. While talking to a veterinary colleague in Aspen Creek, I found out that a few months ago, around the time Shadow officially disappeared, she was approached to treat a seriously injured German Shepherd. The man who brought the dog didn't give many details, paid in cash and said he would be back to pick up the animal in a few days, but he never returned. My colleague ended up donating the dog to a family of farmers in the area. Edward leaned forward. Was it Shadow? I'm not sure. My colleague didn't take photographs and didn't register the microchip because the man said he would do it himself, but she described the dog as having a characteristic scar on its left shoulder. It could be Shadow. Edward felt a mix of hope and anger. It would mean that someone had tried to care for him initially, or at least keep him alive, but then abandoned him. Do you have your colleague's contact information? I do. I'll pass it on. But Edward, be careful. If you start asking too many questions, the wrong people might notice. I know, but I need the truth. For Shadow, for Claire, and for myself. After Marion left, Edward spent hours researching the farming family. Through a few discreet phone calls, he managed to locate the rural property on the outskirts of Aspen Creek. The next day, he left Claire with Lucy and went there. The farm was modest, with a few head of cattle and cornfields. An elderly man, Mr. Donald, greeted Edward with the typical cordiality of the countryside. When Edward explained that he was looking for information about a German Shepherd that might have lived there a few months ago, the farmer's face lit up with recognition. Oh yes, Thor. That's what we called him. A beautiful creature, but he was in terrible shape when he arrived. The vet said he needed special care, so my wife and I decided to keep him. And what happened? Why isn't he here anymore? Mr. Donald's face saddened. He stayed with us for almost 2 months. He was recovering well, gaining weight, even seemed happy, but then, one night he just disappeared. We looked everywhere, called for him, but he was gone. We thought maybe he had gone back to look for his previous owner. You know how loyal dogs are. Or he was taken, Edward thought, but didn't say it out loud. Do you have any idea how he could have gotten out? Were the fences broken? No, and that was the strange thing. All the fences were intact. The gate was closed. It was as if someone had come in, taken the dog and left, but we didn't see or hear anything, and Thor didn't even bark, which is strange because he always barked when a stranger approached. Edward felt a shiver run down his spine. Shadow hadn't run away. He had been taken by someone who knew how to handle trained dogs, someone with access and knowledge, and then, months later, he was abandoned in the square, as if he were disposable trash. When Edward returned home, his determination was renewed. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together. Shadow had been injured during or after that operation at the warehouse. Someone had taken him for veterinary treatment initially, but without wanting to leave an official trail. Then, when the dog had partially recovered, he was temporarily placed on a rural property, away from prying eyes. But then, something changed. Maybe Shadow became a burden. Maybe those responsible thought the scandal had passed and that the dog no longer posed a threat. So they decided to get rid of him in the cruelest way possible, hoping he would die alone or be euthanized as a stray. But they hadn't counted on Claire. They hadn't counted on the compassion of a 7-year-old child who saw a suffering being and decided she had to save him. They hadn't counted on the determination of a father who would not accept injustice, even when it came from within his own department. That night, Edward decided to do something he had been avoiding. He called Dr. August Ferrer directly, the investigator from Internal Affairs who had been in Captain Bridges' office. The call was answered after a few rings. "Dr. Ferrer, this is Sergeant Edward Nolan. I have additional information related to my complaint that I need to share with you." There was a pause before Ferrer responded. "Sergeant, are you aware that our conversation may be recorded?" "I am, and I have nothing to hide." "Very well, you may speak." Edward recounted his conversation with the farmer, the intimidation attempts against Dr. Marion, and his growing suspicions about how Shadow had been hidden and then discarded. Ferrer listened in silence, asking pointed questions here and there. When Edward finished, Ferrer sighed heavily. "Sergeant, you are putting together an interesting case, but I must be frank with you. Without concrete physical evidence, without witnesses willing to speak on the record, this is all just circumstantial. Accusations against established members of the department require more than well-founded suspicions. So what do you suggest I do?" "Continue living your life. Take care of the animal. Take care of your daughter. And let Internal Affairs do its job. If there is anything of substance to your allegations, we will find it. But you need to stop conducting your own parallel investigation. It will only put you in danger and potentially compromise an official investigation. With all due respect, Doctor, I can't just sit and wait. Not when there are people trying to intimidate an innocent veterinarian. Not when my family might be at risk." "Your family will be at much greater risk if you keep poking a hornet's nest that clearly has dangerous hornets. Take my advice, Sergeant, be patient. Justice is sometimes slow, but it arrives." The call ended, leaving Edward frustrated, but also with a new perspective. Ferrer had indirectly implied that Internal Affairs was taking his allegations seriously. But he had also made it clear that Edward needed to back off, at least publicly. The next day, Edward received a completely unexpected visitor. It was mid-afternoon, and he was in the yard with Claire and Shadow when the doorbell rang. When he opened the door, he found a young man of humble appearance, no more than 18 or 19 years old, nervous and clearly frightened. "Are you Sergeant Nolan?" "I am. Can I help you?" The young man looked around, as if checking if anyone was watching him. "My name is Gabriel. I used to work as a security assistant at that warehouse in the countryside, the one where there was a police operation a few months ago." Edward felt his heart pound. "Come in, please." Gabriel entered hurriedly, and Edward led him to the living room, closing the curtains. The young man was visibly nervous, his hands trembling slightly. "I shouldn't be here," Gabriel began, "but I can't live with this anymore. I need to tell someone what I saw." "Stay calm. You're safe here. Tell me everything." Gabriel took a deep breath before starting. "I was hired to do surveillance at the warehouse, mostly night shifts. They told me it was to protect stored goods, normal stuff, but I knew there was something strange. Important people would arrive in the middle of the night, expensive cars, always very secretive. I didn't ask questions. I needed the money." "Were you there on the night of the police operation?" "I wasn't on shift that specific night, but I was there a few days before. I saw when they arrived with the police dog, a huge, handsome German shepherd. They were conducting an operation, and the dog started sniffing a specific area of the warehouse, an area that was always kept locked where even I wasn't allowed to go. And then the dog got agitated, started digging and barking. The officers seemed nervous. One of them, the one who seemed to be in charge, an older officer, he pulled the dog away quickly. He seemed angry. But before they left, I saw him make a call. He was arguing on the phone, saying something about a problem, about how the animal had found something it shouldn't have. Edward felt the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Did you hear anything else?" he said. "Not everything, but I caught some pieces. He said the dog was a problem, that it needed to be dealt with discreetly. And then, a few days later, my supervisor called me. He gave me a strange task. He said I had to take a dog to a specific rural property and leave it there with the owner, a farmer who had agreed to keep it for a while. They gave me the address and extra money to keep my mouth shut. Was it Shadow? I don't know his name, but it was a German shepherd, the same one from the operation. He was injured, scared. I took him to the farm as I was told. And after that, I tried to forget about it. But I couldn't. And now, after I heard that you found this abandoned dog in the square that you're asking questions, I felt I had to come here. Because what they did to that animal wasn't right, and if there was something in that warehouse important enough that they needed to hide a police dog, then people deserved to know the truth." Edward was in shock. Gabriel was the witness he needed, someone from outside the department who could corroborate his theory. "Are you willing to testify officially? To speak with Internal Affairs?" Gabriel hesitated, the fear visible in his eyes. "I'm scared. The people involved in this are powerful, but I'm also scared of staying silent. So yes, I'm willing. I just need protection." "I will make sure you have it," Edward promised. "I'll put you in touch with Dr. Ferrer from Internal Affairs. They can protect you while they investigate the case." After Gabriel left, with Ferrer's number written down and the promise that he would be contacted soon, Edward sat on the sofa, his head spinning with the implications of that testimony. Finally, he had something concrete, an independent witness who could connect the dots between the warehouse operation, Shadow's disappearance, and the cover-up attempts. "Daddy, is everything okay?" Claire's voice interrupted his thoughts. The girl was standing in the living room doorway, Shadow by her side, both looking at him with concerned expressions. Edward opened his arms and Claire ran to him, jumping into his lap. "Everything's okay, sweetheart. In fact, it's getting better. Come on, let's go take care of Shadow. He deserves all the treats today." That night, after Claire had gone to sleep, Edward received a call from Dr. Ferrer. Gabriel had made contact, and his story was being verified. If everything was confirmed, it would be a significant breakthrough in the investigation. Ferrer also informed him that other people were starting to come forward, encouraged by Edward's courage in filing the initial complaint. The wall of silence was beginning to crack, but Ferrer also had a warning. "The people you're reporting know that the net is closing in. That makes them even more dangerous. Double your precautions. Keep your family safe, and trust the process." Edward promised he would be careful. When he hung up, he went out to the yard where Shadow was lying in his doghouse. The dog lifted his head as Edward approached. "You knew, didn't you?" Edward spoke softly, stroking Shadow's head. "You knew there was something wrong in that warehouse. That's why they had to silence you. But you survived, buddy, and now together we're going to make sure the truth comes out." Shadow looked at Edward with those deep eyes that seemed to understand much more than an animal should be able to. And in that silent moment in the yard, under the starry Aspen Creek sky, man and dog made a connection that went beyond words. It was a mutual promise of loyalty, courage, and justice,